So, when somebody talks about an input output table, what do they essentially mean? Now, an input output table is essentially a representation of how inputs are converted to outputs. That is the very obvious interpretation of an input. Let me just write that down: input output table. And this input output table is analyzed through something called the input output analysis or the IO analysis. So if that is what people talk about, let's say somebody is talking about an IO analysis. So what IO analysis is all about is it analyzes the structure that an economy follows in terms of production. Why I'm talking about production is that production is essentially the arrangement or the structure in which input is converted to output. So an economy can follow different structures when it's producing its production or when it's producing its output, and that is what essentially is the crux of the concept. Now, it has of course, since it's called an input output table, it has a table. Now, how do we read this input output table? So before we read or learn how to read the input output table, we need to know the components of the input output table, right? So what I'll be doing now is I'll be drawing a very rough and a very schematic representation of the input output analysis. It's a short representation, and it's a simplification rather than oversimplification, but an important oversimplification nonetheless, in order to understand the bigger picture of what we have. So in this case, what we are assuming, the first thing that we are assuming is that an economy has two sectors. So instead of taking multiple sectors, we are just taking a two-sector economy. Now, what do I mean by a two-sector economy? This economy produces only two goods, right? This economy does not have a lot of sectors taking part in it. It just produces two goods. Let's say the economy produces some good one, so it has some good 1 and it has some good 2. So this is G1 and G2. What I'll be doing is I'll be writing the same thing on this side as well, G1 and G2. Now, if I'm talking about the number of rows and number of columns in my, let's say, my table, I'll be, the input output table is not essentially rectangular, so to say. It's not exactly like a table with equal number of rows and columns on each side. It has a very different structure. So let me just draw that for you once. This is pretty much how it looks like. A very rough version nonetheless, but this is how it looks. So let's say an economy produces Z11 amount of okay, let's say the economy produces a total of X1 amount of good G1. Now this X1 amount, Z11 of it is reverted back to the economy to produce G1. So let's look at these two look at these two sectors like this. There's this sector G1 and there's this sector G2. Now, what are the inputs for this sector? This sector uses inputs from its own production. So to produce 1 unit of G1, you need some amount of X1. You need some amount of its own goods. So like if you're producing coal, you need the heat. You need heat in the production of coal. When you produce coal, there are a lot of burning involved there. The mechanisms and the machines that you need, they need to work, they need energy to work, right? The coal machines, the machines that produce coal, they need energy to work, and this energy is again received from burning coal. So you are using coal to make coal, right? You're using the production, you're using the output of that sector itself to produce output from that sector. So it's like x1 is moving back to G1 for the production of that good itself. You are using the output of your own sector as a raw material in your sector. If I am producing a pen and I need to keep accounts of my pen production, I'll use the pen again. So I am using my own output. So that's one raw material. Now the other raw material is actually part of the output of the second sector, so x2. So if g1 is producing x1 amount of output, let's say g2 is producing x2 amount of output, right? Now, G1 uses some amount of raw materials from its own sector, that is X1, and it is also using some amount of raw materials from the other sector, from the output of the other sector. So it's using, if it's producing coal, and if these two sectors are would the most usual simplification for this is agricultural sector and industrial sector. So agricultural sector uses some food for its own self. The people who work in the agricultural fields, they need food themselves, so they use their own output to feed themselves. So if this is agricultural field, the agricultural fields are using their own food to feed themselves, and they are also using industrial machines. They are using tractors, they are using other fertilizers and pesticides and insecticides. So they are also using the output of the industrial sector. So let's say the amount of output from its own sector that goes into the production of the first sector is Z11, and the amount of uh, G1 that goes into the production of X2 is Z12, right? So let's say these are the components. Now these two, so similarly G2 is sending Z21 amount of its own goods to production of G1, and Z22 amount of its own outputs to the sector G2. So let me use a different color and re-explain this. So what I usually do is I move in this direction. So G1 is one sector. G1 is sending Z11 amount of its output to G1 itself. So it's reverting back to its own sector. It's part of that coal that the coal sector produced in order to produce coal again. Z12 is moving from G1 to G2. Since the arrow's movement is this, so it's this way, G1 to G2. So it's G1 to G2. So this is the amount of sector 1's output. Since G1 is on this side, so it's moving from G1 to G2. So it's part of G1's output that goes into the production of G2. So Z11 is the amount of G1's output that goes into the production of G1, and Z12 is the amount of G1's output that goes into the production of G2. So what is this again? This is the amount of output by G2, by sector 2, that goes into the production of G1. So it's part of, if G1 is the if G1 is the agricultural sector and G2 is the industrial sector, and I was talking about the industrial and agricultural connection, then G1 would be the amount of rice or amount of food grains that the agricultural sector consumes in itself to feed itself and to sustain itself. And G2 is the let's say the tractors, the fertilizers and the pesticides that the industrial sector produces and used by the agricultural sector. So this goes from sector 2 to sector 1. So that's Z21. Similarly, Z22 is that part of sector 2's production which has reverted back to sector 2 for its own productions. This part is used for production of sector 2. Now, these are the inputs that are used in the production process itself. Now, let's say I have produced a total of 5 units of agricultural output, or 5 units of the first sector. Now, of this Z1, so let's call that 1. So let me just put some rough values for the time being. Let's say this value is 1, this value is 1. Let's take simpler values so that we'll be able to understand. And let's say this is also 1, so this is also 1. Let's say this is I'd say this is 5, and this is 4, right? Most developing countries start with major production agriculture, and then they move towards industrial production. So let's start with this economy, a very small economy. Now, sector 1 produced a total of 5 units of output. It used 1 unit of its own output in its own production, and it sent 1 unit of production to sector 2. So that's G1 to G1 and G1 to G2. So this part, rather, let me highlight that for you. If yeah, this part accounts for 2 units of production. It used 1 unit for its own product, 1 unit as reverted back to its own production process, and 1 unit is sent to the other sector. But it you produced a total of 5 outputs, right? 5 output units. So where did the other outputs go? The other output is the other output is called the final demand. So it's called the final demand. Now, what is the final demand? First of all, the final demand will be the rest of the production. So it's 1, 5 minus 2, that's 3, right? So what is this final demand all about? Now, if I'm talking about the agricultural and industrial output, the agriculture uses some portion of its output to produce further output. The industrial sector uses some output of the agricultural sector, because the industrial workers also need food to sustain themselves. They are using some amount of food. The industrial workers, these are the agricultural workers that are using some agricultural output, and these are the industrial workers that are using some amount of agricultural output. The industrial output and the agricultural output are not the only people who produce, or the only people who consume agricultural food or food grains. There are common people, normal people, who also eat agricultural output, normal people who eat food grains. They might not belong to either of these categories. They might actually be people from outside our country. These might actually represent people from outside the country who are buying our own food grains, right? So this component is called the final demand component. It's like the final amount that is being sold in the market, if you want to interpret it in that way. It's the final demand. So this represents the leftover from the production. So this is the final demand. These are the inputs that are used in the production process, and this is the total output of that factor. Similarly, this is one. So the inputs accounted for in the production process itself is 2 units, but the sector actually produces 4 units. So this will be 2 in order to account. Now, if I let me just remove some of these symbols, so that will be easier then. Can I just remove these? Yeah, I can remove these. So let me remove this to get some space. Now, there's this beautiful relationship that we can find out. So now, what are these boxes for? These boxes are for, actually, you can interpret it in one way: Z11 plus Z12 plus, call this F1. So if I call this F1, if I actually remove these, so let me rub this out and let me rub this out. Let me rub these as well, because we now know what these are actually all about, and let me rub these as well. This will stay, but let me write that in red so that it's part of the table. This is the final demand component. So this is F1, this is F2. Now, once we have this part of the table, we can get this beautiful relationship: Z11 plus Z12 plus F1 actually gives the value X1. Similarly, Z21 plus Z22 plus F2 gives the value X2. So the amount of X1 can actually be accounted for in terms of the raw materials used by other sectors and the final demand for that sector. So when you look at an input output table, of course the input output tables won't be this simple. If you look at India's input output table, for example, one day I might show you in the videos, they actually add up horizontally to get to this number. If you add them up horizontally, you get to this number. So this is one way of looking at the input output table, horizontal interpretation of looking at the input output table. This horizontal way, this actually looks at how the product of one sector is being distributed into other sectors. So it's sector 1, some of it is moving into sector 1, some of it is moving into sector 2, some of it is used in the final demand or the final consumption of that commodity or of the output of that sector. So this looks at the way the output of that sector is distributed in the economy. This is one way. Now, the next question that you might ask is, we are looking only at this part, there's this part as well, what is wrong with this part, why are we not talking about this? Thing is, this is the next way of interpreting the input output table. So what we do is we write x1 and x2 here. Now this is actually part of an identity. So when people actually build I don't know, 24 sector economies, 25 sector economies, India is, as far as I remember, it's either a 24 sector economy or something of that sort. I'll just check that out, or I'll probably write it in the description box. So check down in the description box to find out how many sectors are there in the Indian economy. Now, when the input output analysis experts, when they create these boxes, when they create these tables, they actually ensure that this row is actually the, so to say, the transpose of this column is actually the transpose of this row. So these values should match at the end of the entire analysis, putting all these values, because they are calculated from collecting data from different sources and adding and subtracting. There are a lot of other um, should I say, complications involved, because we'll be doing more calculations. Actually, there'll be certain other components introduced in this final demand component. Most of this is a very oversimplification. There are actually other subdivisions of the final sector component, but this is pretty much the basic structure. What the analysts ensure is that this row should this column should actually be equal to this row. So this x1 should be equal to x1, x2 should be equal to x2. Now, this, as I mentioned before, this direction is how the sector of the output of this sector is distributed in the economy. This direction, actually, let's call this V1 and call this V2. So what are these V1 and V2? This direction looks at the production side of X1. So now, let me reiterate the meaning of Z11 and Z21. Z1, Z11 rather, is the amount of raw materials that was used by sector 1 from its own output. So the Z11 was used in the production of actually G1. So this is the part that produces, and these are the sectors that the raw materials move into. So Z11 is actually used by sector G1. The Z11 amount of input is actually used by the first sector, and Z21 is the amount of Z2 is the amount of output of sector 2, which is used in the production of Z1. So Z11 and Z21 are both actually inputs used by sector G1. These two inputs are actually used in the production process of sector 1's output. So these two are going into the production of X1. Z11 and Z12 were parts of X1 that were already produced. If my economy produced 5 units, one part of it went to the first economy, went to the first sector, two parts of it, let's say, moved into the second sector, and the rest, if I said if this was 5 and this is 3, so 2 units were actually used in the final consumption. This direction is actually, if this is 5 units, one unit of x1 is needed, and let's say 2 units of x2 is needed for the production of x1. This looks at the production side, this looks at the distribution of the outputs, and this looks at the production of the outputs. Now, what we usually need to ensure in the table is this and this should add up to something like this. There should be an additive relationship here. Now, most of the time, if you look at functions, you'll see, let's say, 1 unit of this input plus 2 unit of this input makes 5 units of this input, something of that sort. Maybe 2 units of this input, 3 units of this input, adds 7 unit of this input output. There's not always this 1 plus 2 equal to 5 relationship. 1 plus 2 is not 5, right? There's some other value involved. So if you produce some amount of, if you use some amount of input to produce 1 unit of, or rather some amount of output, the inputs usually do not add up to the output itself. The value is usually more than that. Where does this value come from? This value can actually be interpreted as the amount of implicit raw materials that you are using. So let's say you're putting in some labor, you're putting in electricity to churn the machines of the production process. There's some other value added to the production, right? Value added. if you have read about national income accounting, you know there's this concept of value added. It's not exactly implicitly there, it's not explicitly there in the production process, but it's some amount of value is added at every stage. So if you're for a brief explanation, let's say a sector produces some amount of wheat, and then there's this wheat mill which produces flour. There's this amount of labor or electricity that is added, but you don't actually put some raw materials in it, right? You don't put in few cups of labor or 3 ounces of electricity to it. There's this implicit way in which you're putting in more raw materials. So that V1 is what moves into the production of X1. So this extra part is actually kind of like V1. So it's like there's some amount of value being added to the production of X1. So Z11 and Z21 were the explicit raw materials that were moved into the production of X1. The X1 sector, the first sector, actually bought monetary values of Z11 and Z21 to produce its output, and then it used some V1 amount of value added, some amount of labor, some amount of electricity to produce the ultimately produce this X1 amount of output. Similarly, V2 is the same. Basically, it's like the value added in the production of X2. So this direction is actually the production side. So the X1 amount of output is generated from Z11 amount of input from its own sector, Z21 from the other sector, since it's going from G2 to G1, and V1 amount of value added. So this is essentially how you read the input output table.